Both of them were part of the Virginia gentry. They were part of the group of people who were eligible to be leaders in Virginia. They would have understood that growing up, and in a very class stratified society as it was, racially stratified, but class stratified as well, that would have informed their sense of themselves, what was possible in the world, what they could do. So that was a tremendously important thing for them to be a member of the Randolph family. Well, Jefferson was in Paris when the revolution was beginning in the years before this time period, in the pre-revolutionary period. 1784 he gets there and leaves in 1789, so he's at the end of his time as a diplomat is when the revolution is really kicking off, and he was supportive of it. He actually thought that it was a good thing. He had traveled in the French countryside, and he saw, and actually in the city, saw the tremendous gap between rich and poor, and thought that something had to happen in the society. People had to change things. And so he was in favor of the French Revolution and continued to be in favor of the French Revolution, even after it sort of went off the rails. And he just thought that this was sort of a spasm, probably would have word he would have used, of liberty, that people were actually taking control of their lives. So he thought the French Revolution was a good thing, and it obviously became a big part of the 1790s and politics in the United States, with people taking sides on this question, but he saw it as a positive thing. This was the age of revolution. Around the world, people were going to be breaking off their chains and getting rid of monarchy and moving to a better system, hopefully a Republican systems of government. He thought that people who didn't see that just were not paying attention. And perhaps even more dire were people who secretly wished for the old ways, that they really had not freed themselves from monarchy and moved towards the idea that the people should rule. By this time, he is full on into partisan politics and partisan views, and his idea that the Federalists are actually the enemy of the revolution, that they want a system of government that is monarchical, that is British in its conception or its influence, and he thinks that anything that they say against France was likely something cooked up, made up to make our ally look bad, our revolutionary ally look bad. So he thought that this was something that, was all made up, and that Marshall had concocted this. Well, he was trying to strike a note of unity after the bloodbath that had taken place in the 1790s, the really tough partisan rancor. We think of our times being divisive now. It was actually the same. It was actually maybe more so at that particular moment, and it was crucial because the country was just starting. So he wanted to strike a note of conciliation. He had his plans to get rid of Federalists, obviously. I don't think he meant that literally, because at one point later on he says the Republicans are the Americans. But this was a note to suggest that he was not going to be retaliatory, and that he was willing to work with people. He feared judicial despotism. He saw Adams's actions as he's leaving office, appointing all of these federal judges and officers, as a way of extending Federalist rule at this point. And he saw the notion that the judiciary could control or should have the final say on matters to be a usurpation of the rights of the president and the rights of Congress, that they were supposed to be co-equal branches. And he was concerned about the rise of judicial power. In this tripartite system, Congress represents the people, the executive is the action, the person who could carry out Congress's actions, and the judiciary is supposed to render judgments. That's actually a Hamiltonian formulation, but that's what Jefferson was thinking at this particular time. And he saw this effort to put judges in, to have the judiciary, to rule by the judiciary, was anti-democratic. And so that's what he's looking at, that this is a possibility of judicial despotism. Jefferson thought that Marbury v. Madison was an attack on his administration, and he thought that having been made president, he should have the right to make these kinds of appointments and to have all these people put in at the last moment, and particularly since Marbury's commission had not been delivered, he did not think it was legally sound, and so he should not have to recognize that. But he saw this as an attempt to extend Federalist rule through the judiciary, through any means necessary, and so he did see it as an attack on his power. He was suspicious of Burr because of the tie. Things did not go the way they were supposed to in the election of 1800. The understanding, Jefferson thought, was he was supposed to be the president and Aaron Burr would be the vice president, and when Burr did not immediately back off, that made him suspicious of him, and from the very beginning. And then they had cordial relations, but when Burr, after the duel with Hamilton, which he doesn't talk about, begins to do things out west, it's not sure what he was actually planning. Some people say that he was trying to just revolutionize Spanish America and bring it for America, that was what he was trying to do. Other people saying that he wanted to set up his own country. And Jefferson was very suspicious of his motives. I mean, it took him a long time to get there. A number of people wrote to him about Burr. You need to look at what he's doing out there. You need to pay attention to this. And when he finally comes to the conclusion that Burr is in fact trying to make a new country, take something from the United States, he becomes very, very suspicious of Burr and sort of obsessive about all of it. He was convinced of it and was very, very paranoid about it. Relations between the United States and Spain were tricky at the time, and that this was something that was an interference with that, and it made him livid. He thought that this would be a rabble, that he would actually, people who were adventurers would want to join in this, possibly, and that this could be something that was successful. And he was very, very concerned about this, anything that had to do with foreign policy, and he had a vision of the United States and the West in particular, that this was going to be part of America, the United States of America, an empire for liberty or empire of liberty. And anything that interfered with that, he thought, was a threat. Jefferson was not thrilled with Marshall's biography of Washington. He thought that it was made up, that it didn't tell the true story. He wanted to find people who would tell a true history of the American Revolution and the Washington administration and all of that. So he wasn't pleased by all of that. He understood that Marshall admired Washington. He admired Washington himself. He thought in some levels Washington had, in fact, been led astray by Hamilton and Marshall and other people. But he thought that this, again, was an extension of Federalist policies. By the time Jefferson actually does, in a way, sink, and he promised to sink the Federalist Party into the abyss, and he actually did do it, that and other things. And so he saw any effort to make a sort of Federalist vision of what happened during that time period as a resurrection of the party. So he was not happy about it at all. Jefferson, in understanding the notion of impairment of contracts was something that was important, but he was upset about any attempt to nationalize the government. And Marshall's plan, he saw this as another part of Marshall's plan to use the Supreme Court as a way of nationalizing the country, in a way, nationalizing laws and so forth. So he was suspicious, again, of any of Marshall's opinions and anything that could possibly take away from the state's rights to take action. This notion of the earth belonging to the living is a trope that Jefferson uses quite a bit. He famously writes to James Madison when he's in Paris, and actually finishes the letter. When he gets here, the earth belongs to the living, that every generation had the right to have a constitution, to have its laws that reflected their particular understandings. And to the extent that lawyers held to precedent and priests held to ideas that made them the sort of arbiter or the go-between between citizens and God, they were people who were trying to exercise power, and exercise power that could go from generation to generation without being questioned. And so he saw them as detrimental to the future, that these were people who did not allow for unfettered understanding about what the present required and what the future required. Jefferson uses the press and believes in the importance of the press as a way of disseminating ideas and disseminating the ideas of a particular party. The press at that time was definitely partisan, unlike it's partisan today, but it was openly partisan, and this is part of the apparatus of extending the ideals of the Republican Party. Because newspapers, which he thought were very, very important, got what he considered to be, when he agreed with them, the truth out to the American public, and that this was a way of being vigilant about what was going on and keeping a record of what was going on. Even though he was in retirement, Jefferson was still in some ways the sort of head of the Republican Party. People looked to him for leadership in his letters and writing to people. You could sort of see what he wanted and understood which direction people should go. So he thought that this was part of the process. Newspapers, and he had known from the 1790s, were critical to the New Republic and the new Republican Party system. And the newspapers were sort of, the Fourth Estate is a part of the process as well. And so he applauded that kind of thing. Of course, if there were things he didn't like, he railed about that as well. But he thought that this was a way of informing people, and that was important. Jefferson was alarmed about the tensions of the election of 1800 because the country was still new. It was not clear. We look at it from the perspective of a country that has existed for a couple of centuries, and we think that things are going to go on and they keep rolling along. He understood that this was a new project, and it was a fragile prospect. No one knew where it was going to go, what could happen. There was talk of the possibility of some sort of conflict if he were not made president during this time period. So it was a very, very volatile moment, and it was a period when things could have fallen apart. They could always have fallen apart. It was all very new, and so he was concerned. Jefferson, who was described as having a cool and even temperament. Madison Hemmings described him as having a cool and even temperament, and other people said that as well. Very amiable person, very calm. The dam falls apart, is washed away, and he just very calmly says, well, we just got to build another one, and so forth. But he was a very passionate person, and a lot of this was hidden beneath this exterior of calm. He could get really, really angry, and Marshall managed to make him very angry at times, and he expressed it in his writing. Jefferson can be very, very passionate in his letters when he's upset about something, the language that he uses. Everything is very, very extreme, and he uses extreme language when he gets angry, and it shows itself in his writing. That's where he takes out his passion and his anger about things, and Marshall was a frequent object of that. He certainly pursued it with Burr. In the treason trial, he pursued it to the point of obsession. Yes, he gets his operatives going at various points when he's a political figure, and even when he's in retirement. He lets people know what the story is. He can follow through on things. He has the capacity also, however, to draw back if he feels that the situation is over. And there was a moment when he co-signed a note for his grandson's father-in-law, and the note, he defaulted on it, and Jefferson became liable for a huge amount of money. And the story is that the man was passing by one time, and he went down to greet him and to say hello to him, even after he had done something that basically caused his ruin. That was a coup de grace, Jefferson described it in his finances. So he could get very, very angry and then calm down. But if he thought the situation was continuing, and he saw Marshall, I think, as a continuing threat. It's not like one thing happened and then that was it. There was case after case, more nationalizing of the government. Jefferson thought Story might have been on his side, and then Story becomes, under the influence of Marshall. So he saw Marshall as a continuing threat. It's not personal. This sounds like The Godfather, but it's not personal. It's business. The idea is that there were two very, very contrasting visions of what the national government was supposed to do and what it couldn't do. And Marshall just kept rolling along with this, from Marbury on to Marbury through all the other cases. And Jefferson saw him as a continuing irritant. He thinks that Marshall is going to, he fears that Marshall will in fact be persuasive, and that, that he will lose the person who he's counting on to, to make a difference in all of this. So it doesn't work out the way he wanted to work out, and Marshall triumphed in making the Supreme Court a co-equal branch of government. It's hard for people today to realize what a sort of ramshackle affair it was at the very beginning. They didn't even have their own, gorgeous building or whatever, and a lot of people didn't want to be on the court, and Marshall took it and made it into something that was a co-equal branch, something that the beginnings of what we know today. Some people say it may not be co-equal now, that Jefferson's fears have come to fruition with all of that, that you have a court that is above everything. But Marshall actually made a place for the court. Jefferson respected Marshall's capacity to argue and to persuade and to use material for his own good. He was a good lawyer. That's what lawyers do. Jefferson was a good lawyer as well, and he'd done that kind of thing in his day. But he thought Marshall was particularly good at it. Twistifications. I love that word. To sort of get the things that he wanted to do. And he thought that Marshall could persuade people. And that caused him a great amount of fear, to have an opponent who was effective. An ineffective opponent, you can just sort of play on their own weaknesses, but that's not what he was dealing with Marshall. Mm-hmm. Jefferson, with Hamilton and Marshall, these are people who are good at what they do, and they were not pushovers, and that's why he continued to be irritated by Marshall for the rest of his life, really. The American Colonization Society was of the view that slavery should be ended in the United States, but that African American people should be sent back to Africa, that they could not live in a multiracial society. America was not going to be a multiracial society. So he and other prominent figures, James Monroe, lots of people belonged to the American Colonization Society. That was considered to be the liberal position. The conservative position was obviously enslaved people remained in bondage. But Marshall was a part of the American Colonization Society because he believed that emancipation should come, but that blacks could not stay in the United States. Jefferson never joined. He believed in colonization, or he said he believed in colonization, and he wrote about that in Notes in the State of Virginia, but he was not a part of the group. Marshall believed in the American Union. He was a nationalist, and he thought that the Revolution had brought forth together a country that was one nation. And a league, you can come and go. And it's a looser confederation, which is what we started out with, and it was very, very important for him to establish that a union had been made, and the union is perpetual. And that kind of notion was something that I believe he would have adhered to. And a league is less formal, and that's not what he wanted the country to be. What would Marshall have done in the Civil War? I think Marshall probably would have been on the side of the Virginians who were reluctant to leave. I think he would have been opposed to secession. But who knows what would have happened after Fort Sumter? Once the shooting starts, what do you do? And I don't know. I think he probably, it's hard for me to imagine him in Virginia, in the country that he knew, even if he was an American and saw a union going against other Virginians. That would have been a real tough one. Initially, I think the same thing with Jefferson. I think initially, and his grandson was opposed to it in the beginning, because he understood what the sacrifice that had been made to create the American Union. But once the shooting starts, then whether you want to go or not, you're going to go with your uncles and aunts and fathers and brothers and so forth, as many people did. Some people remained true to the Union, but I think it would be very, very hard after shooting started for Marshall to say, you know, that it didn't matter and that he was going to remain loyal to the Union. But again, it's an impossible question. I suppose the one I might pick is Marbury v. Madison, to wonder why he decided to take the case. If he's saying the court has no jurisdiction, you typically don't go beyond that to make a decision. I think Johnson v. McIntosh, the case about Indian property rights, and basically describing that it's too late to do anything about the system of property that exists in the United States. And he talks about the Europeans' belief in their superiority over Native Americans. I mean, he seems to be sympathetic in some ways to Native Americans in some of his opinions. And I would like to get at if he'd ever thought of any kind of alternative, if anything else could have been done. Certainly in Worcester v. Georgia, he makes the determination that federal law should control over the states in terms of dealing with Native Americans. And again, that's a part of nationalism. That's a thread that's running throughout all of these things. Gibbon v. Ogden, all of it is about establishing the supremacy of federal law. But I would like to talk to him about the cases that deal with Native Americans and to see, because there is some sense of sympathy for them, but at the same time, in most of the cases, he ends up, following the law that basically ends up taking their property. The two-party system begins in the 1790s, and people suggest that it got its impetus in Democratic-Republican clubs that started to form around the 1790s, when people are getting together, ordinary citizens are getting together to talk about the Washington administration and to sort of put forth their ideas about government that are sort of contra the Washington administration. Washington thought these things were unconstitutional because they were parties, and he was against the notion of factions, is the term that was used at the time. Before then, there was no sense of Democratic Republican is what they ended up being called, or Federalist. There were people who have different ideas about things, but they hadn't coalesced into formal parties in the way we see them. But these Democratic Republican clubs are sort of a precursor to this. And eventually, and people understood who was on Washington's side and who might have been on the other side, Jefferson's side, 1796, and then the election of 1800s. But they get started with people understanding that they had a revolution, but they had different understandings about what that meant and what came next after all of that. So in the 1790s, with the rise of newspapers, newspaper editors have influence and are putting these ideas out. The Democratic-Republican parties that start in the 1790s, eventually we move towards a point where people began to identify with groups of people. And then there are the Federalists, and then there's the Democratic-Republicans. So it's a 1790s phenomenon tied up with the Jay Treaty, tied up with the French Revolution, all these kinds of things, as these people are realizing, we fought this war and we created this country, but we now have some different understandings about what that actually means. And so parties grow out of that, that sense of a divergence in views about what next steps the country should take.